The Bluebird Diner sat on the corner of Main and Fifth like it had been there since the beginning of time, which in the small town of Millbrook wasn't far from the truth. The neon sign buzzed and flickered in the pre-dawn darkness, half the letters burnt out so it just read, Bail, you. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the front door at 5:30 in the morning, same as she had every day for the past 3 years, her uniform already showing signs of wear, even though she'd just put it on 20 minutes ago. The fabric was thin from too many washings, the name tag slightly crooked because one of the pin clasps had broken months back. She tied her apron around her waist with practiced efficiency, the muscle memory of this routine so ingrained she could probably do it in her sleep. The diner smelled like it always did, that mixture of old coffee, bacon grease and the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaner that never quite covered up the decades of cooking odors that had soaked into every surface. Frank was already in the kitchen, had been there since 4, getting the grill ready and prepping the morning specials. He raised a spatula in greeting without looking up from the eggs he was cracking into a large metal bowl. Sarah grabbed the coffee pot, the glass warm in her hands, and began her opening routine. Check the sugar dispensers, wipe down the counters, make sure the salt and pepper shakers were full, flip the sign on the door from closed to open. The first customers would arrive in 15 minutes. The early risers, the construction workers heading to job sites, the long-haul truckers passing through on Route 40. She knew most of them by name, knew their orders before they sat down, knew which ones wanted conversation and which ones wanted to be left alone with their coffee and their thoughts. This was her life now, had been for 3 years, ever since her mom got sick and the medical bills started piling up faster than Sarah could count them. She'd dropped out of college halfway through her sophomore year, packed up her dorm room, driven back to Millbrook, and picked up the first job she could find. The Bluebird wasn't glamorous, the tips weren't great, but it was steady work and Frank let her pick up extra shifts when she needed them. Her mom's cancer treatment was expensive, even with insurance, and the insurance company seemed to find new and creative ways to deny coverage for things that seemed pretty damn essential to keeping a person alive. Sarah had learned more about medical billing codes and appeals processes than any 23-year-old should have to know. She'd learnt about payment plans and collections agencies and what happens when you can't afford to fill all the prescriptions the doctor writes. She'd learnt that being poor and sick in America was like being trapped in a burning building where every exit cost money you didn't have. But she didn't think about that while she was working, couldn't afford to let herself go down that mental rabbit hole during a shift. She focused on the coffee pot in her hand, the sound of Frank's spatula scraping against the grill, the comfortable rhythm of another morning at the Bluebird. The bell above the door chimed, and old Mr. Peterson shuffled in, same time as always, heading for his usual booth by the window. Sarah grabbed a mug and followed him, the coffee already pouring before he'd even settled into his seat. Some things in life were predictable, and right now, standing in the warm yellow light of the diner, with the familiar sounds and smells surrounding her, Sarah found comfort in that predictability. She had no way of knowing that in less than 3 hours, a stranger would walk through that door and everything would change. The morning rush had come and gone by the time he walked in, leaving Sarah with that mid-morning lull where she could actually catch her breath and maybe grab a stale donut from the display case if Frank wasn't looking. She was refilling the ketchup bottles, that mindless task that somehow always needed doing, when the bell chimed and she looked up out of habit. The man who entered didn't fit the usual Bluebird demographic, not even close. He wore a suit, but it was wrinkled like he'd slept in it, the jacket expensive looking even with the creases, the kind of fabric that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. His tie was loosened, top button undone, and he had that rumpled look of someone who'd been traveling too long or thinking too hard, or maybe both. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his face unshaven with a day or two of grey stubble, his hair slightly wild like he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. He carried a leather briefcase that had seen better days, scuffed and worn at the corners, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who was either very tired or very drunk, or possibly both. The other customers, the ones lingering over their coffee and newspapers, looked up when he entered, that small-town instinct to catalogue strangers, to figure out where they fit in the established order of things. This man didn't fit anywhere they could immediately categorize, and that made them wary. Sarah watched him scan the diner before choosing a booth in the back corner, away from the windows, away from the other customers, tucking himself into that spot like he wanted to disappear. She grabbed a menu and a glass of water, crossed the worn linoleum floor with its pattern of faded diamonds that might have been cheerful once, decades ago. Up close she could see more details about him, the way his hands shook slightly when he took the menu, the expensive watch on his wrist that caught the fluorescent light, the faint smell of whiskey and airplane and exhaustion that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. His eyes, when he looked up at her, were bloodshot but intelligent, assessing her in a way that made her straighten her spine a little, lift her chin. She'd dealt with enough men who looked at waitresses like they were part of the furniture, to recognize when someone actually saw her as a person. This man saw her, really saw her, and something about that direct gaze made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite name. He ordered coffee, black and the breakfast special without really looking at the menu, his voice rough like he'd been smoking or shouting or hadn't used it in a while. Sarah wrote it down on her pad even though she didn't need to, old habits, and headed back to the kitchen to clip the order to Frank's wheel. When she brought the coffee, the man was staring out the window at nothing in particular, his fingers drumming an irregular rhythm on the tabletop. She noticed his nails were clean and well kept despite his disheveled appearance, noticed the calluses on his fingertips didn't match his expensive clothes. He was a collection of contradictions, this stranger, and Sarah found herself wondering about his story even as she told herself it was none of her business. The other customers had gone back to their newspapers and conversations, but she caught them sneaking glances at the man in the corner booth, that small-town curiosity that never really went away no matter how hard you tried to mind your own business. Frank rang the bell and she picked up the breakfast special, eggs over easy, bacon crispy, toast with butter on the side, hash browns scattered and smothered the way the menu described them. She set it down in front of the stranger and he thanked her, his voice still that rough gravelly quality, and then he did something unexpected. He looked her straight in the eye and asked her name. Sarah told him her name, because it was on her name tag anyway, and because there didn't seem to be any harm in it. He nodded like she'd confirmed something he already knew, which was odd, and then went back to his breakfast. He ate slowly, methodically, like someone going through the motions of a necessary task, rather than enjoying a meal. Sarah went back to her refill rounds, checking on her other customers, bringing checks to the ones who were ready to leave, that endless cycle of service industry work that filled her days. She was wiping down the counter when the man in the back booth called her over. She expected him to ask for his check, maybe more coffee, the usual end-of-meal requests. Instead, what happened next would replay in her mind for months afterward, every detail crystallized in that strange way traumatic or significant moments tend to be. The man reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of bills, not from a wallet but just loose, rubber-banded together like drug money in a movie. He set them on the table between his empty coffee cup and his half-finished eggs. Sarah could see there were hundreds, couldn't miss the distinctive face of Benjamin Franklin, repeated over and over in that neat stack. She'd never seen that much cash in person, not all at once, not anywhere outside of a bank. The man looked at her with those tired, bloodshot eyes, and said something that made her stomach drop. He needed a favor, he said. He needed her to say she'd seen him here all morning, from opening until now. He needed her to tell anyone who asked that he'd been sitting in this booth since 5:30, that she could swear to it, that she'd remember him specifically. He pushed the stack of bills toward her across the scarred laminate tabletop. There were 20 bills in that stack. She could see the edges, could do the math in her head instantly. $2,000. $2,000 for a lot. Sarah felt her mouth go dry and her heart start hammering in her chest, in that fight or flight way that meant her body understood the danger even if her conscious mind was still catching up. She looked at the money and then back at the man, and for just a second, just the briefest flicker of time, she let herself imagine what $2,000 could do. It could pay for her mom's next round of medication, the ones the insurance company had denied, the ones that cost $1,600 out of pocket. It could catch her up on the electric bill that was 2 months overdue. It could buy new tires for her car, that was driving on rubber so thin she could probably see the road through it if she looked hard enough. $2,000 was more than she made in a month of working double shifts and smiling until her face hurt. But even as her brain was doing that desperate calculation, that survival math that poor people learn to do automatically, another part of her was screaming danger. This man wanted an alibi. He wanted her to lie about his whereabouts. That meant he was planning to be somewhere else, doing something he shouldn't be doing, Or maybe he already had been somewhere doing something he shouldn't have done and needed to cover his track. Either way, accepting this money meant becoming part of something illegal, something potentially dangerous, something that could destroy what little stability she'd managed to build for herself and her mom. Sarah pushed the money back across the table, her hands shaking now too, matching his earlier tremor. She said no. She said she couldn't do that. She said he needed to leave. The man stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Then he did something even more unexpected than offering her the bribe in the first place. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face from haggard and dangerous to something almost gentle, almost human. He picked up the stack of bills and put them back in his briefcase with a nod, like she'd passed some kind of test he'd been administering. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times and turned it toward her. Sarah looked at the screen and felt the floor tilt underneath her feet. It was a news article, one of those business website layouts with too many ads and pop-ups. But the headline was clear enough: tech billionaire Marcus Whalen announces surprise retirement at 52, and there was a photo, a professional headshot of the man sitting in her booth, cleaned up and shaved and wearing a different suit, but unmistakably the same person. She looked from the phone to his face and back again, her brain struggling to reconcile the disheveled stranger with the billionaire entrepreneur on the screen. Marcus Whalen. She knew the name, vaguely, the way you know the names of famous people who exist in a completely different stratosphere of society. He'd founded some tech company in the 90s that had something to do with data security or cloud computing, or one of those things Sarah didn't really understand, but that had apparently made him absurdly wealthy. She'd seen his name in headlines before, usually attached to stories about acquisitions or philanthropic donations or the kinds of business deals that involve numbers with too many zeros for her to properly conceptualize. And he was sitting in the Bluebird diner, looking like he'd been sleeping under a bridge, trying to bribe her to lie about his whereabouts. Marcus Whalen put his phone away and leaned back in the booth, that small smile still playing at the corners of his mouth. He explained, his voice still rough but more animated now, like he'd been waiting to tell this story to someone. He'd announced his retirement 3 days ago, walked away from the company he'd built over 25 years, handed the reins to his COO, and boarded a plane with no particular destination in mind. He'd been running for so long, he said, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of customers, living in a world where every conversation was strategic and every relationship was transactional. He'd wanted to know, he said, what would happen if he just stopped, if he got off the hamster wheel and stepped outside the bubble of wealth and power and constant connectivity. So he'd turned off his phone for a while, got in a rental car, and drove. He'd ended up in Millbrook, because his GPS lost signal and he took a wrong turn. Ended up at the Bluebird because it was the first place he saw when dawn broke and he realized he hadn't eaten in 24 hours. The money, he explained, had been a test. He'd wanted to see what kind of person she was, wanted to see if integrity was a real thing that still existed outside of corporate mission statements and PR copy. He'd offered her what he suspected was a life-changing amount of money to compromise herself, to become complicit in something shady, and she'd said no. Most people, in his experience, didn't say no when you put enough money in front of them. Sarah didn't know whether to be angry or amazed or some confused combination of both. She stood there beside his booth, her coffee pot forgotten in her hand, while this billionaire who'd been testing her moral fiber sat there looking pleased with himself. Part of her wanted to throw him out, tell him he had no right to play games with people's lives, to dangle money in front of someone who was struggling just to see what would happen. But another part of her, a part she wasn't entirely proud of, wanted to know what came next, because there was clearly more to this story. Marcus gestured to the seat across from him and Sarah found herself sliding into the booth without consciously deciding to do so. Frank raised an eyebrow from the kitchen window, but didn't say anything, and the remaining customers went back to pretending they weren't eavesdropping on whatever was happening in the back corner. Sarah set down her coffee pot and folded her hands on the table, waiting. Marcus started talking, and once he started, it was like he couldn't stop, like he'd been holding all of this inside for so long, that having someone actually listen was a physical relief. He talked about building his company, about the early days when it was just him and 3 friends working out of a garage apartment, surviving on ramen and ambition. He talked about the first big contract that changed everything, about going public and watching his net worth balloon to numbers that stopped feeling real. He talked about the board meetings and the quarterly earnings calls and the constant pressure to grow, to innovate, to beat projections, to satisfy shareholders who only cared about the line going up. He talked about his marriage falling apart because he was never home, and when he was home, he was thinking about work. He talked about his kids growing up with a father who was more interested in his laptop than their soccer games or school plays. He talked about waking up one morning in a hotel room in Tokyo, or maybe Singapore, he couldn't remember which, and realizing he didn't recognize himself anymore. The person he'd become was efficient and successful and utterly miserable, so he'd quit, just like that. Walked into the board meeting and resigned, effective immediately. Handed over the CEO role to someone who actually wanted it, someone who still believed the line going up was the most important thing in the world. He'd made arrangements for his ex-wife and kids, set up trusts and funds that would ensure they were taken care of for generations. Then he'd gotten in a car and driven, no plan, no destination, just moving because staying still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering all the years he'd wasted chasing something that turned out to be meaningless. Sarah listened to all of this with a strange mixture of sympathy and resentment churning in her stomach. She understood burnout and exhaustion and the feeling of being trapped in a life you never consciously chose. But there was a fundamental difference between their situations that was hard to ignore. Marcus Whalen had quit his job and walked away because he could afford to. He had enough money to never work again, to wander aimlessly across the country soul-searching in diners and sleeping in expensive hotels or his car, or wherever the hell he felt like sleeping. Sarah couldn't quit. She couldn't walk away. She was trapped by necessity, by medical bills and rent and the basic math of survival that didn't care about her dreams or her mental health or her need for meaning. She could work herself to exhaustion and still not have enough, while this man could work himself to exhaustion by choice and then simply choose to stop. She said as much, not angrily but matter-of-factly, because it was just the truth of things. Marcus nodded slowly, acknowledging the point, and for a moment he looked even more tired than when he'd first walked in. He knew it wasn't fair. He knew the system was broken, that wealth accumulated in ways that had nothing to do with merit or hard work, that the people who worked the hardest often had the least to show for it. He knew all of this intellectually, but he'd never really understood it viscerally until the last few days, driving through small towns, eating at places like the Bluebird, seeing how most people actually lived. The test with the money, he admitted, hadn't just been about her integrity, it had been about his own guilt. Sarah felt something shift in the air between them, that moment when a conversation stops being abstract and becomes specific, when words start to have weight and consequence. Marcus reached into his briefcase again and Sarah tensed, wondering if the money was coming back out, but instead he pulled out a business card, plain white with just a name and phone number, printed in simple black text. He slid it across the table to her, no flourish, no fanfare. He told her he'd been thinking about what to do with his life now, what to do with resources that were more than one person could possibly need or use. He'd been thinking about building something different from his first company, something that actually mattered beyond shareholder value and market disruption. He wanted to start a foundation focused on medical debt, specifically on helping people who were being crushed by the American healthcare system's particular brand of cruelty, people like Sarah and her mother. He needed someone to help him run it, someone who understood the problem, not from spreadsheets and statistics, but from living it every single day, someone who knew what it meant to make impossible choices between medication and rent, between treatment and food, between survival and quality of life. He was offering her a job, not out of pity, he was quick to clarify, but because she'd demonstrated something that morning that was far more valuable than any credential or resume could show. She'd been offered a way out, a shortcut, an easy answer, and she'd said no, because it was the wrong thing to do. That kind of integrity, he said, was exactly what he needed in someone who would be helping decide how millions of dollars in charitable funding got distributed. Sarah stared at the business card like it might bite her. She asked about salary, about benefits, about where this job would be located, all the practical questions that her brain latched onto, because the alternative was letting herself feel the full weight of what was being offered, and that felt too dangerous, too much like hope, and hope was something she'd learned to ration carefully. Marcus named a figure that made her physically gasp, a salary that was more than she'd made in the last 5 years combined, full health insurance, he added, the kind that actually covered things without requiring blood sacrifice, and 3 appeals. The job would be remote to start while they set up the foundation's infrastructure, so she could stay in Millbrook with her mother. She'd need to travel occasionally, attend meetings, but the goal was to build something sustainable that improved lives without destroying her own in the process. He stood up from the booth, leaving cash on the table for his breakfast and a tip that was generous but not ostentatious. He told her to think about it, to call the number on the card when she'd decided, and then he walked toward the door. Sarah sat there in the booth, the business card in her hand, her entire body shaking with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She watched through the window as Marcus Wayland climbed into a modest rental car and drove away, disappearing down Main Street like he'd never been there at all. Frank called her name from the kitchen, and she jerked back to awareness, realized she was crying, realized the coffee pot she'd abandoned was probably cold by now, realized her whole life had just split into before and after this moment. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and called her mother, the words tumbling out in a confused rush. As she tried to explain what had just happened, her mother listened quietly, and then asked the question that mattered most. Did Sarah believe? Was this real, or was it some elaborate scam or cruel joke? Sarah looked down at the business card, ran her thumb over the embossed lettering, thought about the tired man in the expensive rumpled suit who'd tried to bribe her, and then offered her salvation. She didn't know, but she knew what she had to do. Sarah spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of her shifts at the Bluebird, while her mind spun in endless circles around Marcus Wayland's offer. She'd done her research, spending hours after her mother went to sleep scrolling through articles about him on her laptop in their small kitchen. Everything checked out. He was who he said he was. The retirement announcement was real. His company, CipherCore Technologies, had been a major player in cybersecurity for over 2 decades. He'd been profiled in business magazines, had given TED Talks, had appeared in that documentary about tech entrepreneurs that everyone had watched a few years back. There were photos of him at charity galas and industry conferences, always in a perfectly tailored suit, always with that practiced smile that people in his position learned to deploy like a weapon. Nothing in those photos matched the exhausted, rumpled man who'd sat in her booth, but she supposed that was the point. He'd been trying to escape the person in those photos. She'd called the number on the business card twice and hung up before anyone answered, her nerve failing at the last second. The opportunity felt too big, too impossible, too much like something that happened to other people in different kinds of stories. People like Sarah didn't get offered dream jobs by billionaires. They worked double shifts and worried about bills and hoped their cars made it through another winter. They didn't suddenly jump social classes because they'd made one ethical choice in a diner on a random Tuesday morning, except apparently, sometimes they did. Her mother had opinions, strong ones, delivered from her position on the worn couch where she spent most of her days now, too tired from treatment to do much else. Take the job, she said. Take the job before something happens to make the offer disappear. Take the job because opportunities like this didn't come around twice, and turning it down out of fear or pride or whatever was holding Sarah back would be the stupidest thing she could possibly do. Take the job because they were drowning and someone had thrown them a life preserver, and you didn't question the life preserver. You grabbed it with both hands and held on tight. But Sarah worried. She worried this was too good to be true. She worried Marcus Wayland was some kind of con artist running an elaborate scam, even though her research suggested he had more money than he could possibly need from any scam. She worried she wasn't qualified, that she'd fail, that she'd somehow mess up this chance and confirm every negative belief she had about herself and her place in the world. She worried she was being naive, that there would be strings attached, that nothing was ever really free, and eventually she'd discover the catch hidden in the fine print. Most of all, she worried about what would happen if she said yes and let herself hope, and then it all fell apart anyway. Hope was dangerous when you'd spent years learning to live without it. It was Frank, surprisingly, who gave her the push she needed. He found her in the walk-in freezer during her break on the third day, sitting on a stack of boxes and staring at the business card like it held the secrets of the universe. He sat down beside her, his old knees creaking with the effort, and told her a story she'd never heard before. He'd owned the Bluebird once, years back, before medical bills from his wife's illness had forced him to sell to a corporate chain that let him stay on as manager. He'd had dreams too, plans for what he was going to do with his restaurant, ideas that never materialized because life had other plans. He'd made peace with it, found contentment in the routine, but sometimes late at night he still wondered what might have been if he'd been a little braver, or a little luckier, or both. "Don't be like me," he said. "Don't spend the rest of your life wondering." Sarah made the call on a Thursday evening, sitting in her car in the Bluebird parking lot, after her shift ended, the engine running for heat against the October chill. Marcus Whalen answered on the second ring, his voice clear and alert, no trace of the roughness from that first meeting. They talked for over an hour while the windows fogged up around her and the streetlights flickered on along Main Street. He outlined the vision for the foundation in detail, asked her questions about her experience with medical debt, listened to her ideas about how to actually help people rather than just throwing money at problems. By the end of the conversation, Sarah had stopped questioning whether this was real and started asking practical questions about start dates and contracts and how exactly one went about dismantling the medical debt crisis, one family at a time. She gave notice at the Bluebird the next day, and Frank hugged her so hard her ribs creaked, genuine happiness radiating from him, despite the fact that losing her meant being short-staffed until he could hire and train someone new. The other regulars threw her an impromptu goodbye party, bringing casseroles and cards and advice about her new life that ranged from touching to bizarre. Old Mr. Peterson told her to invest in good shoes because rich people walk different and she'd need to keep up. Mrs. Chen from the post office told her to never forget where she came from and to always tip service workers generously. The construction crew that came in every morning at 6 pooled their money and bought her a professional briefcase, used but in good condition because they figured she'd need something better than the canvas bag she'd been carrying her whole life. The transition happened faster than Sarah expected. Contracts arrived via overnight delivery, official and binding, and terrifying in their specificity. She signed them at her kitchen table while her mother looked on, witnessing her signature with shaking hands, both of them crying and laughing in equal measure. The first paycheck hit her bank account 2 weeks later, and Sarah stared at the number for a solid 5 minutes before calling her mother in to confirm she was reading it correctly. They paid off every medical bill that afternoon, working through the stack of collection notices and payment plans with the grim satisfaction of people who'd been fighting a losing battle and suddenly had reinforcements. The foundation officially launched 6 months later. The Whalen Foundation for Medical Equity, with Sarah Mitchell listed as Director of Programs on all the official documents. They'd rented office space in a mid-sized city about an hour from Millbrook, close enough that Sarah could commute, but far enough to feel like a real change. The team they assembled was small but dedicated, people who'd been drawn to the mission because they'd lived it or witnessed it or simply couldn't stomach the cruelty of a system that bankrupted sick people. Marcus stayed involved but not overbearing, providing resources and connections while trusting Sarah and her team to make the day-to-day decisions. They started small, identifying families in crisis and paying off their medical debt directly, working with hospitals and collection agencies to negotiate settlements. Then they expanded, funding legal clinics that helped people navigate insurance appeals, lobbying for policy changes at the state level, creating educational resources about medical billing rights. Sarah discovered she was good at this work, not despite her experience but because of it. She knew how to talk to people who were desperate and scared because she'd been desperate and scared. She knew which questions to ask because they were the same questions she'd needed answered. She knew how to cut through bureaucracy and bullshit because she'd spent years fighting those same battles from the other side. The Foundation's first annual report showed they'd helped eliminate over $15 million in medical debt for nearly 8,000 families across 5 states. The numbers were staggering, but Sarah thought about the individual stories behind them, the people who could now answer their phones without fear, who could open their mail without dread, who could focus on healing instead of bankruptcy. A year and a half after that morning at the Bluebird, Sarah sat in a conference room in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify before a congressional subcommittee about medical debt reform. She wore a suit that actually fit, carried the briefcase from the construction crew, and had notes prepared on professional letterhead with the foundation's logo. Before she walked into the hearing room, she pulled out her phone and found the last text message from her mother, sent the night before she'd finally lost her battle with cancer. "I'm so proud of you, you're changing the world. Don't forget to change your oil too." Sarah smiled through tears, pocketed her phone, and walked into the hearing room with her head high. She thought about Marcus Wayland's test in the diner, about the choice she'd made that morning when integrity had seemed like the only thing she couldn't afford to compromise. She thought about how one decision, one moment of refusing to bend, had led to all of this. She thought about the families they'd helped and the work still to do and the strange winding path that had brought her from serving coffee to testifying before Congress. Then she took her seat, looked at the row of legislators in front of her, and began to speak.